What if I told you we only have about 30 more chapters in Elbaf? That's right, Elbaf is set to end around chapter 1200, and this is actually something that we can estimate with a pretty high degree of accuracy, based on Oda's past precedents of how long arcs similar to Elbaf have been, certain specific chapter milestones that Oda has been consistently hitting ever since the time skip, and just from breaking down the narrative plot threads left in Elbaf so far. So to begin with, there is a very important pattern that we can observe starting from the post-time skip onwards in terms of chapter milestones for when arcs end, in milestones of 50, 100, or 150 chapters. As we can see, Fishman Island was 50 chapters, and Punk Hazard was another 50 chapters. So from chapter 600 to chapter 700, we covered Fishman Island through Punk Hazard. Then Dressrosa was a clean 100 chapters, so from chapter 700 to chapter 800, we covered Dressrosa. Then Zou and Whole Cake Island together make for another clean 100 chapters almost exactly, so chapter 800 to chapter 900 covers Zou through Whole Cake Island. Then Wano was exactly 150 chapters. And so finally, I believe that Egghead and Elbaf together are neatly set up to conclude another 150 chapter split. As such, everything suggests that we are set to end Elbaf at around chapter 1200, give or take a few chapters here or there, based on Oda's milestones so far. But first, if you feel like the world is getting a lot more expensive these days, that's because it is. If you've been looking for more ways to save money, then you will definitely be interested in Rocket Money. Rocket Money gives me a single, clear view of my finances. Suddenly, I could actually see everything in one place, instead of bouncing between apps and guessing. And one thing in particular that really helped me was subscription tracking. See, I am absolutely someone who signs up for things, forgets about them, and then keeps paying for things that I don't actually use. Rocket Money puts all of that on one list and makes it way easier to stay on top of what I'm actually using and should be paying for. I've also been using their spending insights, which honestly just makes you more aware. Seeing categories broken down helped me spot areas where I could tighten things up without feeling restrictive or unrealistic. So if you want to get a better handle on your finances, go to rocketmoney.com/morge to try it out for free. You can also scan the QR code on screen or click the link in my description, and you can unlock even more features with a free premium trial when you sign up with my link. Now, assuming that the flashback ends in the next 2 to 3 chapters, that would only give us about 30 chapters to conclude Elbaf, which might sound really short, but it's actually the perfect amount of time that Oda usually leaves for the climax of arc storylines to play out. Let's take a quick look at the history of One Piece to see how this has always been the case. So again, if 30 chapters sounds short, just keep in mind that all of the Elbaf arc that we had prior to the flashback was only about 25 chapters in and of itself. So 30 chapters can cover a lot of content. You can think of it as basically we got about half the arc before the flashback, then we had the flashback, and now from here on we have one more half of the arc to go, which can be covered in 30 chapters. And this makes a lot of sense considering the only thing left in Elbaf at this point is the actual final battle of the arc. And historically, throughout One Piece, pretty much every single arc has had its climactic battle conclude in 30 chapters or less. The only exceptions throughout One Piece are Dressrosa and Wano, but we will get to why those two arcs are exceptions shortly. Aside from Dressrosa and Wano, throughout One Piece history, 30 chapters for the final battle to play out has been absolutely consistent. In Thriller Bark, the entire battle to get their shadows back all the way till they exited the island took less than 30 chapters. In Enies Lobby, from when the battle against CP9 began till when they left Enies Lobby was again less than 30 chapters. Alabasta's entire final battle till leaving the island was just a little over 30 chapters. Fishman Island's final battle till leaving the island is less than 30 chapters. Punk Hazard's final act is less than 30 chapters. Whole Cake Island's entire climax with the Big Mom chase, the Katakuri battle, the wedding cake, and the full island escape is all, again, less than 30 chapters. You might say that Skypiea and Egghead Island seem like exceptions, as their final battles took about 40 chapters to conclude, but that's actually because these two arcs have big flashbacks that are interestingly inserted in the middle of the big big final battles, which is not really the norm, and it's not really relevant to Elbaf, because Elbaf's big flashback is almost over and then the final battle will begin. So even looking at Skypiea and Egghead Island, once we remove the inserted flashback from their final battles, their climaxes are also less than 30 chapters each. So broadly speaking, looking at the entirety of the story, generally Oda is actually very good at consistently keeping the final battles fairly tight, such that when the climax of any arc hits, he is able to wrap up the entire story of the arc in 30 chapters or less, or about 3 volumes. Now, our expectations might have recently become skewed a bit by the recent mega arcs of Dressrosa and Wano, which are the 2 longest One Piece storylines of all time, with climaxes that took about 50 and even 60 chapters respectively. But these arcs don't really apply to Elbaf's narrative structure once we examine what's actually happening within these arcs compared to Elbaf. So the reason that Dressrosa and Wano are structured as much more massive plots than usual One Piece arcs is because from the very start of both storylines, we got a tremendous amount of buildup to a huge revolution that will take place at the climax of each arc. And so everything from the first chapter of both of those storylines was building and setting up pieces for an absolutely gigantic conflict at the end. These arcs also introduce a tremendous amount of side characters and running plot lines, all of which are treated as significant. For example, in Dressrosa, everyone from the Colosseum fighters, the Marines, the Revolutionaries, the Royal Family, the Tontadas, Trafalgar Lawn, on and on, all of these characters were treated as very significant in the storyline, and everyone was given their due focus and spotlight in the narrative in the climax. And Wano was maybe even double the size of everything that Dressrosa had going on. But Elbaf really isn't like that. Elbaf is more of a traditional One Piece arc, where the Straw Hats got to an island, they got to freely explore and meet some characters in the early phases, and the actual conflict wasn't introduced till far later, part way through the storyline. And this conflict isn't some giant war that has been built up from the very moment that they got to the island. Rather, it's a fairly sudden and abrupt conflict with the Holy Knights that has developed in the span of about 10 chapters. We got to the flashback of the arc fairly quickly, and so it's likely that once we return, the conflict will be resolved within the usual 30 chapter stretch that Oda tends to reserve for arc climaxes. Especially considering that right off the bat, Imu even established that there is a timer on this whole conflict. Supposedly, Imu and the Holy Knights need to wrap all of this up quickly to get back to Marijois, where there is already another conflict going on. And most importantly, the cast and the plot threads of Elbaf that we have so far are really tight. This is nothing like Dressrosa or Wano, where there are genuinely countless characters who are being treated as very significant in the plot, who all need fights and who all need spotlight and major character moments in the end. No, in Elbaf, genuinely the only truly majorly important side character is Loki. That's it. Beyond that, maybe you could argue that Hadruden is going to have some sort of decently important role to play, and then we just get to more minor characters like Ripley or Gerd. Elbaf is in fact the leanest One Piece arc that we've had in terms of characters in a very long time. And the same is true when we look at overarching plot threads. Again, this is not something like Wano or Dressrosa, where there are a million plot threads going on at the same time, and tons of things that need to be resolved. In Elbaf, very literally, the only thing that needs to be done at the moment is really just the heroes going upstairs and driving out Imu and the Gods Knights. And it should be especially noted that in this arc, in this situation, Luffy is not even actually supposed to defeat the main villain. There's not going to be some super long battle where Luffy finally defeats Imu because it's just too early. We all know that the final conflict with Imu is going to come in a future arc. So even looking at the battle that we have left for the Elbaf arc, we are not set up for some major extended showdown with Luffy and the big boss. And all other hanging plot threads, like Sanji potentially getting Conqueror's Haki, or Usopp having whatever moment Usopp's supposed to get, or Brook getting through to Gunko's emotions, those are all things that are set to naturally be resolved when the Straw Hats fight Imu and the Gods Knights, which again is still the only thing that is really left to happen in the arc. Now, all that being said, there are a couple caveats that could extend this arc a little bit past the 1200 mark. So to begin with, even though we have a very small and tight group of opponents, really just Imu, 2 Gods Knights, and their manufactured army, Dami Reversi does throw a wrench in the works because we could see some good guys turned into villains, which would extend the length of the fight. I've heard some people suggest that Loki will get Dami Reversi'd. I've seen some people even suggest that Luffy will get Dami Reversi'd. But even in these scenarios, just looking at Thriller trip arc, the whole conflict is still set up to wrap in less than 30 chapters. Now, the major twist that would really extend this arc is if it turns out that the Straw Hats are actually supposed to lose here at Elbaf, which would be an absolutely catastrophic event that would cause everything to really spiral into completely unprecedented territory. Now, I would of course personally love to see that, but I'm not banking on that happening. So the final thing that could notably extend Elbaf well past the 1200 mark would be if, before we resolve the Elbaf conflict, Oda also starts to cut away to outside world events as well. If that's the case, that could add another 10 to 15 chapters to Elbaf. But with all things considered, looking at Elbaf's extremely lean cast of characters, with Oda mainly focusing on the Straw Hats and Loki, and considering how tight the narrative itself is, with a very simple focus of just driving Imu and the Gods Knights out of Elbaf, and considering how this isn't even meant to be the final climactic battle against Imu, where Imu is going to be permanently defeated, as well as considering the fact that Imu literally established that there is already a time limit going for how long he can afford to stay in Elbaf, I think narratively everything is set to wrap up in about 30 chapters, give or take maybe a handful of chapters here or there. Especially considering Oda's very consistent past precedent of the timeline of chapter milestones that he's been trying to stick to. All signs are pointing to him wanting to close Elbaf out by roughly chapter 1200. So let me know in the comments below how long you think that Elbaf still has to go, and if you enjoyed this video then definitely like and subscribe.